Buddha times Camus times Kierkegaard. 3. Responses to the absurdity of existence. Grab plus Asset 1. The wound, the rock. Imagine a man pushing a boulder up a mountain. He knows, with absolute certainty, that the boulder will roll back down. He knows he will walk back down after it. He knows he will push it up again, and again, and again, forever. No finish line, no reward, no one watching. 3 thinkers look at this man, and each one sees something completely different. The first, a tuberculosis-stricken orphan from Algeria, says, "Push. There is no meaning at the top. There never was. Push anyway, and scorn the gods who condemned you." The second, a tormented Dane who never recovered from a broken engagement, says, "You cannot push alone. The weight is infinite. Only by trusting a power beyond yourself can you bear it." The third says nothing for a long moment. Then, "Before you push, look at your hands. Why are they gripping? You assumed the rock was the problem. What if it's the grip?" Grab plus Asset 1. The wound, the promise. Albert Camus, Søren Kierkegaard, Siddhartha Gautama. 3 people separated by continents and millennia who all started from the same wound. The discovery that human life does not come with built-in meaning, that we crave purpose the way lungs crave air, and the universe offers silence in return. But where they located the problem and what they prescribed could not be more different. And here's the thing that makes this more than intellectual history. The place where you instinctively locate that problem right now, outside yourself, in a relationship, or inside your own mind, is already shaping what solutions you can even see. You've already chosen a direction. You just may not know which one. Grab plus Asset 1. The wound, open loop. By the end of this, you'll have a framework, not an answer, a framework, for understanding why these 3 positions feel so different despite starting from the same diagnosis. And the key insight is one that almost no comparison between existentialism and Buddhism ever makes clearly. That what Camus called the absurd, this supposedly brute, irreducible feature of reality, the Buddha would say is not a feature of reality at all. It is something your mind is actively manufacturing moment by moment through a specific cognitive process that has a name, a mechanism, and, unlike anything in Camus, an off switch. But we're not starting with the Buddha. We're starting where the conversation actually began, with a man in Copenhagen who looked at his entire civilization and diagnosed it with a disease no one knew they had. In 1849, under the pseudonym Anticlimacus, Søren Kierkegaard published a book with one of the most unsettling opening claims in the history of philosophy. Not that life is hard, not that God is dead, something worse. That you are in despair right now, and the fact that you don't feel it is the most dangerous form of the disease. Grab plus Asset 1. The wound, Kierkegaard's diagnosis, despair. Kierkegaard's The Sickness Unto Death begins from a deceptively simple observation. You are not a thing, you are a relation, specifically a relation that relates itself to itself. You are a self that is aware it is a self, that can reflect on being a self, that can refuse to be the self it is, or try desperately to be a self it can't become. And this reflexive structure, this hall of mirrors quality of consciousness, is not a gift, it is a trap. Because the self is a synthesis of things that don't fit together. You are finite, but you imagine infinity. You are temporal, but you sense eternity. You are necessity, but you dream of possibility. And these tensions cannot be resolved by the self alone. The self cannot heal itself by looking at itself harder, any more than an eye can see itself directly. This is Kierkegaard's foundational move, and it matters enormously for what comes later. Now, despair. Forget everything you associate with that word. The sadness, the crying, the dark room. Kierkegaard doesn't mean any of that. He means a structural condition, a misrelation within the self. And he identifies three forms, each deeper than the last. The first, and most common, is not knowing you have a self at all. This is the person who fills life with busyness, entertainment, social roles, career milestones, and never once confronts the question of who they actually are beneath all of it. Kierkegaard considered this the most widespread form of despair in his society. Every comfortable, well-adjusted citizen humming along, in despair, not because their life is bad, because they have never met themselves. The second form, knowing you have a self, but not willing to be it. You see who you are, your limitations, your past, your inescapable situation, and you refuse. You want to be someone else, something else. This is the despair of weakness. The third form, and this is where it gets interesting for our conversation, is willing to be yourself, defiantly. You see who you are, and you insist on it, proudly, rebelliously, but on your own terms, against the power that made you. Kierkegaard called this the despair of defiance. Remember that phrase, it will matter when we get to Camus. Now, there's a crucial biographical footnote that makes all of this more than theory. Grab plus Acete 1, The Wound, Regine. In 1841, Kierkegaard broke off his engagement to Regine Olsen, a woman he loved and never stopped loving for the rest of his life. He returned her ring. She begged him to stay. He refused. Why? He never fully explained. Scholars have spent nearly 2 centuries debating it, but in his journals, one entry cuts through all the speculation. If I had had faith, I would have stayed with Regine. Read that again. Not, if I had been braver. Not, if circumstances were different. If I had had faith. Kierkegaard broke his own heart and built an entire philosophy around the wound. The question that drove everything he wrote after that moment was not abstract. It was agonizingly personal. What would it take to make the leap he couldn't make? What kind of faith could bear the weight of an existence that reason alone cannot justify? His father believed their family was under a divine curse. As a child, freezing on a heath, the elder Kierkegaard had cursed God and spent the rest of his life convinced that all 7 of his children would die before him. 5 of them did. Søren watched his siblings die one by one and inherited a fortune soaked in guilt and dread. This is not a man doing philosophy as a career. This is a man trying to survive his own consciousness. Grab plus Acete 1, The Wound, Pivot to Camus. So that's the wound as Kierkegaard saw it. The self cannot reconcile its own contradictions. Despair is universal. The only resolution, the only way the self can rest transparently, as he put it, is by grounding itself in the power that created it. Faith, not as comfort, but as the most terrifying act a human being can perform. Hold that. Because almost exactly 100 years later, on the other side of Europe, a young man read Kierkegaard, admired him deeply, and then accused him of the single worst thing a thinker can do. Grab plus Acete 1, The Wound, Camus' Counter-Diagnosis, The Absurd. The year is 1942. Paris is under Nazi occupation. Albert Camus, 28 years old, is editing Combat, an underground resistance newspaper, while simultaneously finishing a book about whether life is worth living. The biographical details matter. Camus' father was killed in the First World War when Albert was less than a year old. His mother was nearly illiterate, partially deaf, worked as a cleaning woman in Algiers. At 17, Camus was diagnosed with tuberculosis, in an era when that was often a death sentence. He was barred from the career in academia he'd been working toward. So when Camus opens the myth of Sisyphus with the sentence, "There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide," this is not provocation for its own sake. This is a man standing in the middle of actual destruction, asking an honest question. Given everything, given all of this, is there a reason to keep going that doesn't require lying to yourself? His answer builds from a precise diagnosis. The absurd is not a property of the world. It's not a property of humans. It is born in the confrontation between two things: our desperate need for meaning, for coherence, for purpose, for the universe to answer when we call, and the universe's absolute, impenetrable silence. Neither side alone is absurd. A silent universe with no one in it to demand meaning. Not absurd, just empty. A meaning-seeking creature in a meaningful universe. Not absurd, just fulfilled. The absurd lives only in the collision. It requires both terms, the human who asks and the world that does not answer. And Camus surveyed the available responses to this collision and found exactly three. The first, physical suicide. You remove one term of the equation, yourself. Camus rejects this, not on moral grounds, but on logical ones. Suicide doesn't resolve the absurd. It just destroys one side of the confrontation. The question outlives you. The second, what he calls philosophical suicide. And this is where Kierkegaard enters his crosshairs. Grab plus Acete 1, The Wound, The Accusation. Camus read Kierkegaard carefully. He called him perhaps the most engaging of the existential thinkers. He respected the diagnosis, despair as structural, not emotional, universal, not personal. On the level of analysis, Camus and Kierkegaard were remarkably close. But then, and you can almost feel Camus' temperature drop when he writes this, Kierkegaard leaps. Having stared into the abyss with extraordinary courage, having cataloged the precise dimensions of human despair with surgical clarity, Kierkegaard vaults over the entire problem into the arms of God. And Camus calls this, in a phrase that still stings, philosophical suicide. Not because faith is stupid, not because God doesn't exist, but because the leap murders the thing that made the diagnosis possible in the first place: reason, consciousness, the willingness to hold both terms of the absurd without flinching. Kierkegaard flinched. He traded the unbearable tension for resolution. He traded confrontation for consolation. Notice what Camus is really saying. The problem isn't that Kierkegaard went wrong. The problem is that he wanted desperately to be cured. And for Camus, the man with tuberculosis, the man who knew what it meant to live with a disease that doesn't go away, wanting to be cured was itself a form of dishonesty. The important thing, Camus wrote, is not to be cured, but to live with one's ailments. Kierkegaard's despair of defiance, willing to be yourself on your own terms? Camus would say, almost. You diagnosed the disease perfectly. You mapped every contour. And then at the last moment, you couldn't bear it, and you jumped. So what does Camus prescribe instead? If you can't kill yourself honestly, and you can't leap to God honestly, what's left? That answer involves a man, a rock, and an act of imagination that has haunted philosophy for 80 years. But before we get there, before we hear what Camus thinks is left after you strip away every consolation, hold this question, because it will matter when the third voice enters. Is it possible that both Kierkegaard and Camus are looking at the same wound, prescribing different remedies, and neither one has considered that the wound itself might be manufactured? That the collision between a meaning-seeking self and a silent universe might not be a brute fact of existence, but a product of a specific cognitive process, observable in real time, that a man sitting under a tree 25 centuries ago took apart piece by piece. We'll get there. First, Camus' rock. Act 2. Two answers. So we have two diagnoses on the table. Kierkegaard says, you are in despair because the self is a contradiction. It cannot resolve alone. You are finite, reaching for the infinite, temporal, grasping at the eternal. And no amount of cleverness, success, or distraction can close that gap from the inside. Camus says, the absurd is born in the collision between your hunger for meaning and the universe's refusal to provide it. Neither term is the problem. The confrontation is the problem, and it never goes away. Both agree on one thing. This is not a feeling. This is the structure of being human. Now, what do you do about it? Act 2. Two answers. Kierkegaard's answer, the leap. Kierkegaard's answer arrives through a story, not his own story this time, though his own story haunts every line. The story of Abraham. God tells Abraham to take his son Isaac, his only son, the son he waited 100 years for, the son who is the fulfillment of every promise God ever made, to take this boy to the top of Mount Moriah and kill him. And Abraham goes. He doesn't argue. He doesn't negotiate, not this time. He wakes up early, saddles the donkey, takes the boy, and walks for 3 days toward the mountain. 3 days of silence. Kierkegaard fixates on those 3 days. In fear and trembling, he circles this story obsessively, approaching it from angle after angle, because he believes it contains the secret structure of faith. And faith terrifies him precisely because he could never fully perform it himself. Here is what makes Abraham incomprehensible, according to Kierkegaard. Abraham does not resign himself to losing Isaac. That would be the night of infinite resignation, the tragic hero who gives up what he loves for a higher ethical principle and earns our admiration for his sacrifice. We understand the tragic hero, Agamemnon sacrificing Iphigenia, Jephthah and his daughter, terrible but rational. The loss is real, the logic is visible, and we weep with recognition. Abraham does something entirely different. He believes, simultaneously, that God demands Isaac's death and that he will get Isaac back, not in heaven, not metaphorically, in this life, on this mountain, by virtue of the absurd. This is what Kierkegaard calls the movement of faith, and it is the point where language begins to break. Because it is not a conclusion reached by reasoning harder. It is not optimism, not denial, not bargaining. It is, and Kierkegaard insists on this, a movement the intellect cannot make. Reason can take you to the edge. It can show you the full dimensions of the abyss. But the leap across is a different faculty entirely. And this is why Kierkegaard distinguishes the knight of faith from every other human type. The knight of faith looks ordinary from the outside. He goes to work, eats dinner, enjoys his evening. Kierkegaard imagines him looking like a tax collector, but internally, at every moment, he is performing the double movement, infinite resignation, giving up everything, and then, by virtue of the absurd, receiving it all back, not once, continuously. Faith is not a decision you make on a Tuesday afternoon, and then it's done. It is a posture you hold against the full weight of reason, forever. Now, and notice something important for our three-way comparison. Kierkegaard is not offering comfort. He is not saying, believe in God and everything will be fine. He is saying, faith is the most demanding, most terrifying, most incomprehensible act a human being can perform. It requires you to suspend the ethical, the entire framework of rational right and wrong, not because you're irrational, but because you've reached the outer wall of what rationality can do, and faith begins on the other side of that wall. The vector is upward, beyond reason, beyond ethics, beyond the human, towards something that cannot be argued for, only leaped into. Kierkegaard spent his life describing this leap with agonizing precision. He never claimed to have made it himself. If I had had faith, Regine would have remained mine. The philosopher of the leap, forever on the edge, forever describing what it looks like from the side that doesn't jump. That's one answer. The self cannot heal itself. Leap. Now, the man who called that leap murder. Act 2. Two answers. Camus' answer. Revolt. Camus' third option, after rejecting both physical and philosophical suicide, is revolt. And to understand what he means, you have to understand what he doesn't mean. He doesn't mean political rebellion, though he lived that too. He doesn't mean anger, though there's plenty of anger in him. He means something very precise. The constant confrontation between the human and the obscurity of the world. Keeping both terms alive, refusing to collapse the tension by eliminating either side. You do not kill yourself. That removes the questioner. You do not leap to God. That removes the silence. You stand in the middle, fully aware that the question will never be answered, and you refuse to look away. This is where Sisyphus returns. Camus asks you to picture him. This man condemned by the gods to push his boulder up the mountain for eternity. The labor itself is not the point. Camus barely lingers on the pushing. What interests him with the intensity of a man writing during an occupation, surrounded by death, is the descent. The moment the rock rolls back down and Sisyphus turns to walk after it. That is what Camus calls the hour of consciousness. The pause between two identical cycles of meaningless effort. The moment when Sisyphus is fully aware of his condition. No distraction, no hope, no illusion, and walks back down anyway. And Camus makes a claim so audacious it has provoked readers for 80 years. This is a moment of victory. Not despite the awareness, because of it. Sisyphus knows. He knows the rock will roll back. He knows there is no resolution. He knows no God is watching. No reward is accumulating. No lesson is being learned. And he goes back down, conscious, defiant, sovereign over his own fate precisely because he expects nothing from it. His fate belongs to him. His rock is his thing. And then the line, the famous line, the line carved into 1,000 dorm room walls, the line that people either find liberating or infuriating, and rarely anything in between. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Now, sit with this for a moment, because it's easy to rush past. Camus is not saying, pretend the suffering doesn't matter. He is not saying, think positive. He is making a radical claim about consciousness, that the fully lucid awareness of your own condition, stripped of every hope, every consolation, every metaphysical safety net, is itself a form of freedom. That Sisyphus, at the bottom of the hill, in his moment of total clarity, possesses something the gods who condemned him do not: the knowledge of his own fate, owned rather than inflicted. The vector is horizontal, no transcendence, no escape, no resolution, just the walk back down and the walk back up, and the full defiant consciousness of exactly what you're doing and why it changes nothing. It matters, biographically, humanly, that the man who wrote this was 28 years old, had already survived tuberculosis and poverty, was risking his life daily in the resistance, and would be dead at 46, killed in a car crash on a road he wasn't supposed to be on. A man who had a train ticket in his pocket, but accepted a last-minute offer to ride with a friend. The philosopher of the absurd, killed by absurd chance. He didn't just describe the condition. He lived inside it, and it consumed him. Act 2. Two answers. The tension between them. So here they stand, two answers to the same wound. Kierkegaard: the self cannot bear its own weight. Leap upward into the arms of a power you cannot prove and cannot argue for, and receive everything back by virtue of the absurd. Camus: the self must bear its own weight. That is the entire point. Any leap is betrayal of honesty, of consciousness, of the courage that makes us human. Stay horizontal, push the rock, scorn the gods. Kierkegaard would say Camus is trapped in the despair of defiance, the third and deepest form. Willing to be yourself, on your own terms, against the power that made you. Heroic, but still despair. Camus would say Kierkegaard is performing philosophical suicide, the most sophisticated version ever written, which makes it the most dangerous. You diagnose the disease with genius-level clarity, and then you fled into the one remedy that requires you to stop thinking. Notice, each accuses the other of the thing they fear most. Camus fears irrationality. Kierkegaard fears self-sufficiency. Each one's answer is the other one's nightmare. Act 2. Two answers. Enter the third voice. And this is exactly where the conversation has been stuck for a century. Leap or push, faith or revolt, upward or horizontal. Two options, both internally coherent, both persuasive, both impossible to choose between without already having the temperament that leads you to one or the other. But what if there's a question neither of them asked? Camus examined the collision between self and world. Kierkegaard examined the structure of the self that collides. But neither won, and this is the hinge of everything that follows. Neither one stopped to examine the mechanism that produces the collision in the first place. What if the self that seeks meaning and the world that refuses meaning are not two independent realities crashing into each other, but two constructions generated by the same cognitive process? What if the absurd is not something you discover, but something you build, moment by moment, thought by thought. And what if you could watch yourself building it? 25 centuries before Camus wrote his book in occupied Paris, a prince in northern India asked a version of the same question, not as philosophy, but as autobiography. He looked at old age, sickness, and death. He felt the same mismatch, a creature that craves permanence in a world that offers none. And his first move was not to leap, not to revolt. His first move was to sit down, get very quiet, and watch what his own mind was doing. What he found there changes the shape of this entire conversation. Act 3, the third voice. Buddha's diagnosis, dukkha as relational. Here is where most comparisons between Buddhism and existentialism go wrong. They start with the sentence, "Life is suffering," Buddhism's supposed first principle, and then map it onto Camus' absurd or Kierkegaard's despair, as though all three are saying the same thing in different accents. They are not, and the difference is not subtle. In the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the very first teaching after his awakening, the Buddha does not say, "Life is suffering." SN 56.11. What he says is far more specific and far more radical. The 5 clinging aggregates are dukkha, not life, not existence, not the universe. The clinging aggregates, the bundles of form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness that you mistake for a solid self. Dukkha is not a weather report about reality. It is a diagnosis of what happens when the mind grips. The scholar monk Thanissaro Bhikkhu translates dukkha not as suffering, but as stress. And that seemingly small word choice changes everything. As he puts it, you can romanticize your sufferings. You cannot romanticize stress. Suffering sounds noble, existential, worthy of philosophy. Stress sounds mechanical, observable, fixable. And that is precisely the Buddha's point. Now, watch what this does to the three-way conversation. For Camus, the absurd is a brute fact. The universe is silent. You crave meaning. The collision is real and permanent. You cannot change either term, only your attitude toward the collision. For Kierkegaard, despair is structural but resolvable, not by changing yourself, but by grounding yourself in something beyond yourself. The self cannot close its own contradictions. Only God can. For the Buddha, dukkha is neither brute fact nor divine problem. It is relational. It arises in a specific, observable relationship between impermanence and clinging. Remove one term and the equation dissolves. You cannot remove impermanence. Everything changes. That's non-negotiable. But clinging? Clinging is not a feature of the universe. It's something you are doing. And what you are doing, you can learn to stop doing. This is the Anattalakkhana Sutta, the second discourse, SN 22.59. Impermanence is not inherently dukkha. Form is impermanent. Feeling is impermanent. Perception, mental formations, consciousness, all impermanent. But impermanence only becomes dukkha when you treat these things as mine, as I, as myself. Strip the clinging, and impermanence is just impermanence. Rivers flow, seasons turn, cells replace themselves. None of this is a problem until a mind shows up and demands it be otherwise. Do you see what just shifted? Camus says, the universe is silent, and that silence is the problem. Buddha says, the silence was never the problem. Your demand that it speak, that is the problem. And that demand is not built into your nature. It is a habit, a very old, very deep habit, but a habit nonetheless. Act 3. The third voice. Buddha's diagnoses. The two arrows and the manufacture of anguish. The Salatha Sutta puts it with almost brutal clarity, SN 36.6. A person is struck by an arrow. It hurts. That's the first arrow. Unavoidable contact with reality. Pain, loss, change. The raw sensory impact of being alive in a body that ages and breaks. Then the untrained person does something peculiar. They resist. They grieve over the pain. They get angry at it. They ask why. They spin stories about what the pain means, what it says about them, whether the universe is fair, whether God is watching, whether life is worth it. And that mental elaboration, that cascade of reaction layered on top of the original contact, is the second arrow. The Buddha says, the first arrow is unavoidable. The second arrow is optional. Now apply this to Camus and Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard feels the first arrow, the genuine contradictions of being a finite self aware of infinity. But his despair, his anguish, the entire elaborate architecture of the sickness unto death, how much of that is second arrow? How much is the mind taking a real tension and spinning it into a sickness that requires the cure of God? Camus feels the first arrow, the real silence of the universe when you ask it for meaning. But his absurd, his revolt, his insistence that one must imagine Sisyphus happy, is that not also a second arrow? A story about the pain that has become indistinguishable from the pain itself. Camus' great claim is that consciousness of the absurd is freedom. But what if that very consciousness, that fixed, clenched awareness of meaninglessness, is itself a form of gripping? The Buddha would say, you are both being struck by arrows and then insisting the second arrow is the real one. Kierkegaard leaps to escape the second arrow. Camus embraces the second arrow and calls it courage. Neither considers that the second arrow could simply be put down. Act 3. The third voice. Papañca. The mechanism that creates the absurd. But the deepest cut, the insight that genuinely changes the topology of this debate, comes from a teaching called the Madhupindika Sutta, the Honeyball Discourse, MN 18. There is a chain, and it goes like this: sense contact, eye meets form, ear meets sound, mind meets thought. From contact arises feeling, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. From feeling arises perception. The mind labels, categorizes, recognizes. From perception arises thinking. And from thinking arises what the Pali calls Papañca, conceptual proliferation. The mind takes a simple moment of contact and elaborates. It builds narratives, identities, positions, grievances, philosophies, worlds. And at the root of this entire cascade, according to the connected teaching in the Sutta Nipata, is the conceit, I am the thinker, SN 414. Here is the argument that almost no comparison between Buddhism and existentialism makes clearly, and it is the one I want you to hold in your mind like a lens. The absurd, this supposedly irreducible collision between a meaning-seeking self and a silent universe, is not a feature of reality. It is a product of Papañca. It is what happens when the mind, through conceptual proliferation, constructs a self, the meaning seeker, constructs a world, the silent universe, and then suffers from the collision between its own constructions. Camus identifies the collision with extraordinary precision, but he treats both sides as given, as bedrock. The self that craves meaning, given. The universe that refuses, given. The gap between them, irreducible, permanent, the fundamental human condition. The Buddha says, look more carefully. The self that craves meaning. Where did it come from? You built it. Thought by thought, proliferation by proliferation, the mind constructed an entity called I and assigned it the job of finding meaning. And the silent universe? Where did that come from? You built that too. The mind took the raw, uninterpreted flux of experience and constructed a world out there that is supposed to provide something in here. The absurd is not a discovery. It is a manufacture. And if you can see the manufacturing process in real time, if you can watch the mind constructing self and world and gap in the space of a single breath, the absurd does not need to be revolted against. It does not need to be leaped over. It dissolves. Not because you've killed reason, because you've seen through the process that reason itself couldn't see. Act 3, the third voice, Sisyphus, samsara, and the question of exit. Now bring Sisyphus back. In the Asu Sutta, the Buddha tells his monks, the tears you have shed through this long wandering in samsara, through countless lifetimes of birth, loss, death, and rebirth, are greater than the water in the four great oceans, SN 15.3. Read that again against Camus. Both are describing cosmic scale, purposeless repetition. Sisyphus pushes his rock forever. Beings cycle through samsara forever. Both images say there is no built-in endpoint, no finish line, no accumulated progress. Just the rock and the hill and the walking back down. But the prescriptions are precisely opposite. Camus says there is no exit. Embrace the repetition. Find happiness inside the cycle. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. The Buddha says, this repetition, this ocean of tears, should generate nibbida, disenchantment. Not depression, not nihilism, disenchantment. The recognition that the cycle is not worth continuing, not because life is bad, but because there is something the cycle cannot provide, and you have been looking for it in the wrong place for longer than you can imagine. And then, critically, the Buddha says there is an exit, nirodha, cessation, the third noble truth. The possibility that the entire mechanism of craving and clinging and suffering can be brought to an end, not by death, not by escape, by seeing through. This brings us to the most dangerous question in the entire conversation. Act 3, the third voice. Is this philosophical suicide? Camus would reject this immediately and forcefully. Any exit, any transcendence, any claim that the absurd can be dissolved rather than endured, Camus would file it next to Kierkegaard's leap, philosophical suicide. Another way of murdering consciousness to escape the tension. And we owe it to Camus to take that accusation seriously, because it is the strongest objection anyone has ever leveled at the Buddhist path from outside it. But does it hold? Philosophical suicide, for Camus, means sacrificing reason to escape the absurd. Kierkegaard does this explicitly. Faith begins where thinking ends. Abraham on the mountain is the model, beyond ethics, beyond logic, into the arms of a God who demands the irrational. Does the Buddha ask you to stop thinking? The Kalama Sutta, AN 3.65, often called the Buddhist Charter of Free Inquiry, says the opposite. Don't go by reports, by legends, by tradition, by scripture, by logical conjecture, by inference, by analogies, by agreement through pondering views, by probability, by the thought, this contemplative is our teacher. Know for yourselves. These qualities are skillful or unskillful. These lead to welfare or to harm. Buddhist faith, sada, is not Kierkegaard's leap. Thanissaro Bhikkhu, in an essay that explicitly cites Kierkegaard, draws the distinction precisely. Sada is confidence in something rational that you cannot fully verify until you have acted on it. It is the beginning of a process that ends in direct knowledge, not a permanent condition of believing the unbelievable. You trust the practice enough to practice. The practice yields results. The results either confirm or disconfirm the trust. If a scientist must trust the method before the experiment produces data, that trust is not irrational. It is the precondition for inquiry. And vipassana, the practice itself, does not decrease awareness. It increases it. The meditator does not look away from the absurd. The meditator looks more closely at it than Camus ever did, and discovers that what seemed like a solid wall is a process. What seemed like bedrock is moving. What seemed like the human condition is a series of rapid-fire mental events that can be observed, understood, and, with practice, released. Camus's Revolt says, "Keep your eyes open and endure." The Buddha says, "Keep your eyes open, look closer, and watch the thing you were enduring take itself apart." If that is philosophical suicide, then every microscope is a murder weapon. The Arya Pariyasana Sutta records the Buddha's own description of his pre-enlightenment crisis, MN 26. "Why do I, being myself subject to birth, aging, sickness, and death, seek what is likewise subject to birth, aging, sickness, and death?" This is the absurd condition, precisely diagnosed. The same mismatch Camus describes, a creature that wants permanence in a world of impermanence. But Siddhartha did not revolt against it. He did not leap over it. He reframed the search, from seeking lasting satisfaction in impermanent things to investigating whether there is something genuinely unconditioned. And the third noble truth is his report, there is. And it is reachable not by faith, not by defiance, but by a practice that anyone can test. Coda three-way fair summary. So, 3 responses to the same wound, and each one deserves to be heard at full strength before you decide anything. Camus is right about something essential. Honesty is non-negotiable. The courage to face reality without consolation, without reaching for a god or a metaphysical exit when the weight becomes unbearable, that is a genuine human achievement. Consciousness, even painful consciousness, is a form of dignity. Sisyphus walking back down that hill, fully aware, choosing to continue. There is something in that image that does not lie. Kierkegaard is right about something Camus misses. The self has dimensions that pure reason cannot reach. The feeling that human life should mean something, that the universe should answer. Kierkegaard takes that feeling seriously as evidence, not as error. And his insight that the most dangerous form of despair is not knowing you're in despair, that most people sleepwalk through an existence they've never truly examined, parallels almost exactly what the Buddha calls avijja, fundamental ignorance. Kierkegaard sees something real, that the self-sufficient, rational, fully autonomous individual Camus celebrates may be the most unconscious figure of all. And the Buddha is right about something neither of them considered. The wound has a mechanism. The mechanism is observable. The second arrow, the mental elaboration, the existential anguish, the meaning crisis, is not welded to the first. You can watch the mind construct self and world and gap in real time, and in the watching, the construction loosens, not through faith, not through defiance, through attention. But fairness demands we also hear what each one might be missing. Camus may be gripping the very thing he diagnosed. His revolt, this perpetual, clenched confrontation with meaninglessness. Is it freedom? Or is it the most sophisticated second arrow ever fashioned? A man who insists on imagining Sisyphus happy may be performing exactly the kind of mental elaboration the Buddha would recognize as unnecessary suffering in elegant clothing. Kierkegaard's framework requires God. If you remove the transcendent ground, the entire architecture collapses, and the leap lands nowhere. For those who cannot believe, Kierkegaard offers diagnosis without cure, and his insistence that the self cannot heal itself. The Buddha would gently disagree, not because the self is powerful, but because the self was never as solid as Kierkegaard assumed. And the Buddha? There is something in Kierkegaard's emphasis on the unrepeatable weight of individual existence, this one life, this one love, this one loss, that the Buddhist framework, with its vast cycles and its cool analytical gaze, may not fully honor. And there is something in Camus's insistence on the beauty of confrontation, the dignity of struggle without resolution, that asks a real question. Does cessation come at the cost of passion? Is the price of putting down the second arrow the loss of everything that makes the human story magnificent and terrible and worth telling? These are not rhetorical questions. They are live wires. Coda, the framework. Here is what I want to leave you with. Not an answer, a lens. Where you locate the problem determines what solutions are even visible to you. If you locate the problem outside, in the universe's silence, in the gap between what you want and what exists, then the only thing you can change is your attitude. You get Camus, revolt, defiance. The dignity of pushing a rock you know will roll back down. If you locate the problem in the relationship between self and God, in the self's inability to ground itself without transcendence, then the only solution is a leap beyond reason. You get Kierkegaard, faith, terror, Abraham walking 3 days toward the mountain. If you locate the problem inside, in the mind's own mechanism of constructing self, constructing world, constructing the collision between them, then neither attitude nor leap addresses the root. You get the Buddha, observation, practice, the discovery that the rock, the hill, and the hands that grip were all built by the same process, and that process can be seen through 3 vectors: horizontal, endure; upward, leap; inward, see. And the question is not which thinker is right. The question is, right now, tonight, sitting where you are, which direction are you already facing? Because the direction you're facing is shaping what you can see. And the most valuable thing any of these 3 can offer is not their answer. It is the ability to recognize that other directions exist. Coda, return to Sisyphus. Imagine the man at the bottom of the hill, the rock behind him, the slope ahead of him, the gods watching from above, or not watching. It doesn't matter. Camus says, turn around, face the rock. This is your fate, and it belongs to you. The walk back up is enough. Kierkegaard says, look up. The weight is not yours to carry alone. There is a hand you cannot see. The Buddha says nothing for a long moment. Then quietly, look at your hands. Are they open or are they gripping? The rock will not answer that question for you. The gods will not answer it. The slope will not answer it. Only your own attention, turned inward, held steady, neither grasping nor pushing away, can show you what your hands are doing right now. And what you see, if you're willing to look, might change what you do next. Or it might not. that too is yours, is